Okay. I will save a little more extensive intro to Rav Elchanan Samet for next week, but for now, just to say that one of the things that I particularly appreciate about his approach, which will very much see modeled this week, is a kind of everything is Torah. Everything in the Torah is Torah. Oftentimes, I'm drawn to the unusual psukim, the things that automatically resonate with homiletical teachings, and I think to a degree we saw that especially with Reb Shai Held, with Levi Zornberg. Maybe Nechama is kind of in the middle, someone who will tackle any topic, but inclines towards a little bit towards the more familiar or more thematic. And Rav Elchanan Samet is sort of someone who's prepared to dive into any pasuk and any topic, and really give it a full treatment, and to try to really analyze all approaches and emerge with a sensible, really a sense of pshat, and kind of incorporate all data. So we're going to get into the weeds this week, and actually, after working through the Hebrew essay, rather than attempt a freestyle translation, given that an English one exists and is slightly abridged compared to the Hebrew, which will help us in particular tonight, we're going to try to work through the English translation version, which was also sent out. So let me share my screen. We'll jump right in, and we'll keep an eye on the time. If it just gets too late, we can pause. Okay. Again, we'll try to move back and forth because there's a lot of technical stuff here, and I hope it will enhance our love of Torah to appreciate kind of the attempt to make sense of things that we often just gloss over. But here it is in the Chumash, and it's worth a closer look and an attempt to discern organizing principles and understand how things might fit into a broader pattern. And the topic here being the censuses in Sefer Bamidbar. And we'll jump right in. He writes, Sefer Bamidbar opens with a description of 5 censuses conducted in the second month of the second year after the Exodus from Egypt. The census of the tribes in chapter 1, the census of the banners, right? The sort of counting up the groupings, the sort of 3 tribes at a time groupings by their sort of banner and encampment in chapter 2. The census of the Leviim aged 1 month and up in chapter 3, census of the firstborn in chapter 3, and then the census of the Leviim between ages 30 and 50 in chapter 4. The description of these censuses occupies all of Parashat Bamidbar, and even the first portion of Parashat Naso. It extends over 4 long chapters, numbering a total of 188 verses. Okay, so there's a lot of time spent counting here in the beginning. The results of the 5 censuses give rise to 41 figures, some of which are stated twice, of which 10 are totals of previous figures. Okay, so we have 41 numbers to deal with, some of which are totals of previous groupings. In the end of the book of Bamidbar, in chapter 26, the Torah describes a census conducted in the plains of Moab in the 40th year, just prior to the nation's entry into the land. It is on the basis of these 2 sets of censuses at the beginning of the Sefer and at its conclusion that Chazal refer to Sefer Bamidbar as Chumash HaPekudim, the book of counting, right? And it's the term numbers refers to that idea as well. Whereas Bamidbar, as the name, comes from, of course, it's very thematically appropriate, but really in the end is drawn from the fact that this is sort of the first unique word in the beginning of the book. But it works out to be a very appropriate thematic title because it describes the setting, which is the journey, the wilderness. But the sages call it Chumash HaPekudim, and we have that also in the word numbers, the name for the book of Numbers. And it reflects that the book begins and ends largely with counting. The table below summarizes the data of the various censuses in the Parashot of Bamidbar and Naso in comparison with the census in Parashat Pinchas. The table shows all 41 figures that appear in chapters 1 to 4 and will serve as the basis of our discussion. Okay, so we're not going to read it all, but we'll just sort of glimpse how it's laid out. You have the count by tribe that appears in Bamidbar chapter 1, and then Bamidbar chapter 2. Each 3 tribes is grouped together, and you have their total. And then we can compare the first column to the third column, where the same tribes are counted in Bamidbar 26. And you can see there's, by and large, not radical change from column 1 to column 3. Shimon undergoes a huge diminishment. That's actually not what he's going to focus on here, but just sort of worth noting. Menashe undergoes a somewhat significant increase, as does Binyamin and Asher. Most of the others are fairly similar. And this allows us to see, so the total of all of Bnei Israel by 12 tribes in chapter 1 is 603,550. That's the same as in chapter 2 when we add up the groupings of 3, and that totals up to the same, 603,550. And then we can compare that to the end of the book when it's 601,730 after the years of wandering in the wilderness. Okay, so that's our first set of numbers. Then we have in Bamidbar chapter 3, the census of Leviim aged a month and upwards, hovering around 6, 7, 8,000, and the total, which the Torah calls 22,000, even though the calculated total is 22,300. So there's a big rounding here in just describing the sum. And then we get the census of the firstborn, which is 22,273. We hold that against the number of Leviim, which, again, this broad rounded totals, it seems, is 22,000. And we're left with 273 Leviim that, or firstborn over and above Leviim, that wind up getting redeemed after this exchange of one Levi for one firstborn. You have 273 firstborn left over. They're redeemed for 5 shekel apiece, which costs a total of 1,365 shekalim. Again, this is just the collection of the numbers here, without getting into the meanings and purposes of each of these activities. And then finally, we have the census of the families of Leviim aged 30 to 50. And we have those numbers here, and we compare them to those a month and older, and the sum total described compared to the end of the book. Okay, again, just glimpsing it and getting a feel. Now we'll start to analyze and come to his central question. A glance at the collection of figures above shows that there are 3 types. Numbers rounded to hundreds. These include 11 of the 12 tribes of Israel, as well as the 3 families of Leviim in the first census, the census of Leviim aged a month and above, in chapter 3. Okay, so we have lots and lots of numbers rounded to 100. Numbers rounded to tens. We sort of give something away here in the word rounded. We'd maybe be better off saying numbers that are expressed as even hundreds, numbers that are expressed as even tens. That's the tribe of Gad, which numbers 45,650. In the census in Parashah Pinchas, at the end of the book, we find once again that 11 of the 12 tribes are even hundreds, while the tribe of Reuven is 43,730. Other figures in this category, even tens, are the families of Gershon and Kahat in the second census of Leviim in chapter 4. And then figures ending in units, meaning that just are ones. All such numbers are related to the census of the firstborn. They are 22,273. The leftover firstborn after the exchange for Leviim is 273, and the number of shkalim by which they are all redeemed is 1,365. Okay, and again, just to even zoom up here, we see in the tribes lots and lots of even hundreds, and then 1 even tens. Here, lots of even hundreds, and then some hundreds and some tens, and only in dealing with the firstborn do we have a few things that are in ones. Okay. What then? Our question. Is the Torah's system for transmitting these numerical data? Does the Torah round to hundreds, to tens, or not at all? It would seem that the Torah does round numbers, and where an exact figure is given in the census of the firstborn of Israel, it is because of the need to calculate the number of leftover firstborn that require redemption with a sum of 5 shkalim each, right? So if we look at it, starting off with the assumption that it's just unlikely that numbers of people are going to automatically turn out to be multiples of 100 by and large, we're assuming that there's some rounding that's going to take place. And the one place where there isn't rounding is because it needs to be expressed precisely, because we're making a calculation and doing a redemption, and therefore we need, there's a kind of a halachic consequence, a sanctity consequence, and so we have to be precise. Pause here to say how, the value proposition here, I guess I'll say, the value proposition here is to sort of say, we're readers of the Torah. The Torah transmits information to us. And it's appropriate to ask. I mean, we ask this in bigger ways at other times. Are we meant to understand these things as precise? And how does the Torah think about counting? What can we learn from it about how the Torah thought about numbers and related when it was taking a census to the way it presented those numbers? Maybe a more or less compelling question, but it's a fair question for readers of the Pshat who want to understand what the Torah is doing and why. And so again, for a Rav Elchanan Samit, this question is no less important to ask than any other big question, and deserves a thorough review. It's not a question I've asked before this week. I sort of just read and say, okay, these are the numbers. But I think I appreciate the challenge to sort of say, why are they here? Were they actually like this? And if not, what is the organizing principle for how the Torah presents them to us? Okay, Rabbi Yeshaya of Trani and the Rosh, the biblical system for rounding numbers. As far as I'm aware, says Rav Samit, the earliest commentator who notes that the Torah rounds figures is Rabbi Yeshaya of Trani, the famous Tosfot Arid on the Talmud, the greatest of the Italian sages of the 13th century. His biblical commentary called Nimukim exists in a few manuscripts in European libraries. It has never been printed, though his commentary on Nach has been most recently in the Mikraot Gdolot HaKeter, but it is cited in the Chidah's commentary on the Torah, Penei David. He cites these comments of Rabbi Yeshaya de Trani. And this is the quote then from this 13th century Italian figure. The numbers of the tribe of Ruvain were 46,500. So he's commenting here on the one number of the 12 tribes that was not expressed as an even 100. Sorry, that's not right. 46,500. He's commenting here on, I guess, the first place where the first count of the first tribe of Ruvain. So the first time we see an even 100, the question is posed. How can this be? Is it possible that there were not one or two less than the figure stated here, or one or two more? We must conclude that the text is not conveying exact figures. As it is written, you shall count 50 days, tisperu chamishim yom. You may recall this from our essay with Nechama Leibowitz a few weeks ago on Parashat Emor, where in actuality we count only 49 days. Likewise, in Devarim, they shall mete out 40 lashes, arba'im yakenu velo yosif, but they really, says the Talmud, mete out no more than 39. So the Torah has other places where it tells us numbers that are multiples of 10, and we know in actuality that's not precisely accurate. So it's clear that the Torah rounds. The examples that the Rid uses to substantiate his claim are somewhat surprising. According to what he says, the Torah usually rounds figures to the nearest 10, even when the number is of decisive halachic significance. Can this be so? His examples are discussed at greater length in Piskei HaRosh at the end of Psachim concerning Sfirat HaOmer. And this quote of the Rosh, at least one of the latter paragraphs of it, we actually did see in Nechama Leibowitz's essay on Emor, which we studied. Some ask, if the verse says you shall count 50 days, why do we count only 49 days? Their forced explanation for the verse is, until the day after the Shabbat, which is the 50th day, shall you count. Or alternatively, that the 50 days refers to the clause, you shall sacrifice. So that the meaning is, until the day after the Shabbat, you shall count, not including this day, 50 days. So up to, but not including 50 days, 49. And on the 50th day, you shall offer a sacrifice, a new offering to God. That's the commentary of Rashi that we saw. But the Rosh says, but it seems to me we have no need for these forced explanations. Since the text says explicitly, 7 weeks shall you count for yourself, we do not count more than 7 weeks, right? The Torah told us 49 days, 7 weeks. The fact that it says you shall count 50 days presents no difficulty, for this is the way of the Torah. When the figure is one less than a 10, the Torah rounds the number to that 10. and makes no mention of the single one missing. Likewise, it says in Breshit, all the members of Yaakov's household who came to Egypt were 70, and also in Devarim, 40 strikes shall they meet. And yet we know that Yaakov's household, if you count up all the people that are mentioned there, it's 69. And that we know from the sages that when the Torah says 40 strikes, we mean 39 lashes. So no problem. The Torah rounds to the nearest 10 when it's off by 1. However, this is now back to Rav Samet. The 3 examples discussed by the Rosh do not necessarily resemble the system of rounding in our parasha. The Rosh speaks of rounding only when a number is within 10% of a round figure, right? Only when it's 1 away from the nearest 10. But the numbers of the tribes in our parasha are rounded, except for one which shall be treated separately. Again, from that list of 12, they're rounded to hundreds. And this is regardless of their fraction of the whole. This rounding could then refer to anything up to 49 more or less than the number indicated in the text. And this system applies to all the figures listed, right? You could have, 27,349, and we're rounding that all the way down to 27,300. That's much more than just moving by 1. That's moving by 49, which is a huge part of the 100 that you're rounding within. So it's not clear that the fact that the Rid says the Torah rounds and gives all these examples of rounding by a single number, by 1 essentially to the nearest 10, that's going to be a good model to prove that the Torah will do this in our case. So thus far, our assumption has been that in recording the censuses, the Torah rounds figures to hundreds, as it would seem from the great majority of those that appear in chapters 1 to 4. But in section B above, we note that there are a few figures in these chapters and another one in Parashat Pinchas that end in tens and not in hundreds. They are the tribe of Gad in our parasha, right? Of the 12 tribes that are counted in Bamidbar, they all are hundreds, except for the tribe of Gad, 45,650. The tribe of Reuven in Parashat Pinchas, and at the end of the book, 11 of the 12 tribes are even hundreds, and Parashat Pinchas, Reuven is 43,730. The family of Kahat, now we're in the 30 to 50-year-old Levites. The family of Kahat, age 30 to 50, is 2,750. The family of Gershon, age 30 to 50, 2,630. What is the reason for these exceptions to the system of rounding to hundreds? Professor Eli Mertzbach of the Department of Mathematics at Bar-Ilan University addresses this question in his article, The Censuses of Bnei Israel in the Desert. Here are some excerpts. It is always possible to attribute this phenomenon of exactly rounded numbers to a miracle or coincidence without any explanation, as some commentators have attempted to do. Rav Samet didn't even entertain this possibility, but he's pointing out to us that this author says, maybe miraculously or coincidentally, these were the actual numbers. The counts of these tribes and of the Levite families just always worked out to be even tens or even hundreds, exactly rounded numbers. But explanations of this sort are rejected by the major commentators with the simple claim that a miracle must have some significance or some benefit, meaning why have this statistical anomaly? Why would God go out of God's way to create a miraculous round numbers just so that they could be listed in the Torah that way? It's not compelling or convincing that a coincidence would happen that way or that a miracle would be used for this purpose. It seems to me that it is possible, says Professor Mertzbach, to explain the phenomenon based on the following principles, which refer to fairly large numbers, but certainly to numbers greater than 5,000. Okay, 2 principles. 1, when the figure obtained is in whole tens, without units, without ones, the Torah records it as is, without rounding it. When the figure obtained is not in whole tens, then the Torah rounds it to the nearest 100. Okay, the logic behind this system is simple. If a number ending in units already requires rounding, it's rounded to hundreds with some small margin of inaccuracy. But if the figure ends in tens, it is left as is. I mean, we want to have round numbers. We always want things that end in 0. So if it already ends in 0, because it's 67,420, we'll leave it alone. But if it's 67,421, we're just going to make it 67,400. And in the Hebrew version, which we don't have here, he explains that well, why round that all the way to hundreds? Why not just round that to tens? And he explains that for numbers this big, the discrepancy of rounding, take my example, whatever that was, 67,400 and 42, rounding that all the way down to 67,400 and you're off by 42, but 42 is actually a really small margin of error compared to the full 67,000, whatever it is. So even though the Roche said, we round only by one, that if we're 69 people went down to Egypt, we can say 70, and here rounding by 40 something seems so big. These are big numbers. So rounding to 100 is not unreasonable. Okay, this is Professor Merzbach's approach. You can already feel it's not super sharp, but at least it provides a model that fits the data. If we examine the data in the Torah, this becomes completely clear. In each of the two censuses of Bnei Israel in the Torah, 11 out of 12 figures are multiples of hundreds, while one, the tribe of Gad in the first census, and Reuven in the second one, is a multiple of tens. Now he's going to point out why this actually works really well. The probability, this is good stuff if you did statistics at any point in your education. The probability of any number ending in 0, but not being a multiple of 100 is 9 out of 100, right? Because you have 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, and 90. These are numbers ending in 0, but not being a multiple of 100, is 9 out of 100 numbers. Therefore, if any 12 numbers are chosen, we can expect the incidence of appearance of numbers with this characteristic, meaning ending in 0 but not being a multiple of 100, to be 12 times that statistical likelihood of 9 out of 100, which is 1.08. In other words, on average, out of 12 numbers, one will be a multiple of tens and not a multiple of hundreds, right? Or a multiple of ones. So understanding what he's saying here, of our 12 tribes, we would expect that one of the 12 tribes will be a number which is a multiple of tens, and that will be left as it is, and all the others will not be multiples of tens, and therefore they will be rounded to 100. Moreover, the greatest possibility exists, once again, when there is exactly one number of this sort out of 12 numbers. Concerning the censuses of the Levites, so this is actually still the Professor Merzbach essay excerpts. Concerning the censuses of the Levite families, we could obtain similar results, but when the number of data is small, there are only 3 families, no statistical test may be applied. Okay, so this is the Professor Merzbach's approach. When it's an even 10, we leave it as it is, and for any other number, we round to the hundreds. Now back to Professor Samet's take. Merzbach's 2 rules for rounding figures explain all 4 exceptional figures listed at the beginning of section D above, right? So that was, going back up to section D, it explains the 45,650 and the 43,730. Those were, exact tens, and that's statistically reasonably likely. The 2750 and the 2630, which is statistically not impossible, and hard to measure because we have such a small sample size there. So those, it's a plausible argument, right? And even match the statistical probability of the phenomenon of the 2 numbers, the tribe of Gad and tribe of Reuven, in the 2 censuses held in the desert. But the simple logic that he employs is actually not so simple. He writes, if a number ending in units already requires rounding, it is rounded to hundreds. But if the figure ends in tens, it is left as is. We may ask, if a number ending in tens is considered a round number, then why are numbers ending in units not rounded to the nearest 10, thereby diminishing the maximal inaccuracy from 49 to 4, right? If it's up till 5, we're going to round down. If it's 6 or more, we're going to round up. We're going to be within 4, I guess 5. The proposition that if a number already requires rounding, it is rounded to hundreds, is not a mathematical one. It is a matter of personal taste. Or a different way to say it is, he came up with a system that fits the data, but from first principles, it's not a great argument of why you why you should. There's no great explanation of why you should take this rounding approach. Setting aside for a moment the exception of the tribe of Reuven in Parshat Pinchas, focusing instead only on the numbers in chapters 1 to 4, we may solve the difficulty of the three exceptional figures without reliance on Merzbach's two rules. Now we're going to get to Rav Samet's approach. Let us first address the censuses of the families in Kahat and Gershon. Right, these were the 30 to 50-year-olds in these two of the three Levite families that were rounded to tens. Okay, these are small numbers, between 2,000 and 3,000, making it unreasonable to round to hundreds. It would appear then that the Torah here rounded to tens, and therefore two of the three figures end in tens. Apparently, the number of the family of Merari, 3,200, is also rounded to the nearest 10, which happens to also be a whole 100. And we can look at these and say, each of them, was in this ballpark of 2,000, 3,000. We rounded all of them to the nearest 10. So the family of Merari was somewhere between 3,196 and 3,205. And so it got rounded to its nearest 10, which was 3,200. It happens to be 100, but that's just because it was the nearest 10 of where it actually landed. And the other two, the 2,750 and 2,630, were within 5 on either side of those numbers, and therefore were rounded to those numbers, to the nearest 10. Okay, so with the Levites, the roundings to 10 make perfect sense. Let us illustrate our claim that the system of rounding figures in the Torah varies in accordance with the size of the numbers, and perhaps even with the importance of the items being counted. In chapter 31 of Sefer Bamidbar, so now we're jumping to a different part of the book, another numbers section in Numbers, verses 32 to 35, we find the various types of booty captured in the war against Midian listed in descending numerical order. Flocks, 675,000. Cattle, 72,000. Donkeys, 61,000. Prisoners, 32,000. All of these figures end in thousands, and it appears that they are rounded to the nearest 1,000. This system is applied because of the large numbers involved, right? If you look back at the census of the tribes, you can see that only one of them breaks 70,000, and only one of them breaks 60,000. So we can say broadly, they're 50,000 or less, with a couple of exceptions. Whereas in this system of spoils, we have a 60,000, a 70,000, and a 675,000. So this is just shifted up some orders of magnitude. All these figures end in thousands, and it appears that they are rounded to the nearest 1,000. This system is applied because of the large numbers involved. In Sefer Shmuel, we read the figures for two national censuses conducted prior to a war, and an additional general population census. The data are as follows. The census at Bezek, preceding the war with Nachash the Ammonite, Bnei Israel 300,000, the men of Yehuda 30,000. The census at Telaim, preceding the war against Amalek, the nation 200,000, men of Yehuda 10,000. Here again, the figures seem to be rounded to thousands, and the figures of Bnei Israel may even be rounded to tens of thousands. This possibility is strengthened by the third census, where David numbers the entire population. Yisrael 800,000, Yehuda 500,000. Okay, so we're already seeing the idea that as orders of magnitude increase, the rounding order of magnitude seems to increase as well. And so what he wants to say thus, he didn't say it super explicitly, but referred to it, is that when it came to the tribes, which were, in the 10,000s, we were rounding to the nearest 100. When it came to the Levites, which were in the 1,000s, we were rounding to the nearest 10. Now we must deal with the number of the tribe of God, 45,650, right? Let's just remind ourselves by going back up to the first chart. So this is the count in Bamidbar 1 of the tribes, and we see, because we're in the tens of thousands, everything is rounded to the nearest 100, but we have this one exception, God, 45,650. Why not just say, one way or the other. So let's get back to where we were. Why is this number not rounded to the nearest hundred? Perhaps because it ends precisely with 50, and therefore cannot be rounded either upwards or downwards, meaning the actual number was 45,650. It's not roundable, so we just left it the way it was. But we may suggest a slightly different idea. Since the exact number 50 cannot be rounded, it may itself be considered a rounded number in a sense, even within a system of rounding to hundreds. Therefore, it is possible that where the real number is close to 50, the number is rounded to 50 rather than to 100, thereby diminishing the inaccuracy that would result from rounding to 100. This could get a little messy because where exactly is that line where you round up or down to 50? Given that there was only one that ended in 50, you would think there would be more. So this to me doesn't land 100%, but at the very least, I think the first argument is a decent one, that maybe there were exactly 50, and that's not a roundable number, so we left it alone. Okay, so let's review. Coming to the last section. For the tribes of Israel, again, which are in the significant tens of thousands, the rounding was to the nearest 100, with the exception of Gad, which was perhaps precisely 50, so it was left alone, or very close to 50, and that was considered very, very round, so it was rounded to there. In a moment, we'll come back to deal with Reuven, because in the census, again, of the tribes at the end of Bamidbar, we would expect the same, since the numbers are of the same order of magnitude, we would expect the same approach, round to the hundreds, and that's true for all of them except for one, Reuven, which is 43,730. We'll have to address why that is. Then when we come to Leviim, the ones aged 1 month and upwards, maybe because this is close to 10,000, we're rounding to the nearest 100. And then the Leviim aged 30 to 50, because it's significantly smaller, we're rounding to the nearest 10, including even Merari 3,200, which might simply be because it was within 5 on either side of 3,200, so rounding to the nearest 10 brought us to there. Okay, so now as we said, we just have to deal finally with the tribe of Reuven in the census at the end of the book. Here we go. The exception of the number of Reuven in the census conducted in the plains of Moab. We must now return to the question that remains open. The number of the tribe of Reuven in the census of Parashat Pinchas, 43,730. The principles we have employed thus far in resolving exceptional figures in chapters 1 to 4 are of no benefit here, right? By everything we've said so far, 43,730 should just go down to 43,700, or maybe up to 43,750, depending on how we view 50. But either way, we don't have a rule for rounding to a 10 for numbers of this size. The purpose of the census, and here's where I think we see his insight in sort of using context to kind of add on to a general mathematical analysis. The purpose of the census conducted in the plains of Moab, this is that second one, is stated explicitly at its conclusion. To these you shall divide the land as inheritance by the number of names. To each according to his number shall his inheritance be given. This is a census of those who will inherit the land, and is conducted a short time prior to entering the land. For this reason, the Torah lists the households comprising each tribe, since the tribal inheritance will be divided among those households. Each section summarizing the details of the census of a certain tribe is structured the same way. For example, the children of Naphtali by their families, of Yachtzael, the family of the Yachtzaeli, of Guni, the family of the Guni, of Yetzer, the family of the Yitzri, of Shilem, the family of the Shilemi. These are the families of Naphtali by their families and by their number, 45,400. There are two clear exceptions to this fixed pattern, the tribe of Reuven and the tribe of Menashe. Following the list of the census of Reuven, which is no different from that of the other tribes, and the total, meaning the list of the census of Reuven gives the families of Reuven and then the sum total. Then we find the following appendix. And the children of Palu, mentioned previously as the patriarch of one of the families of Reuven, Eliav. And the children of Eliav were Nemuel and Datan and Aviram, the same Datan and Aviram who strove against Moshe and Aharon. And the earth opened up its mouth, and it swallowed them and Korach when the congregation died, when the fire consumed the 250 men, and they became a sign, but the sons of Korach did not die. The question is clear. What is this reminder of the sin of Datan and Aviram and their punishment doing in the middle of the data gleaned from a census of the generation that is about to enter the land? If this is supposed to be strict counting and numbers, why do we have this little, history lesson? The second exception to the pattern, meaning the pattern just being that by tribe we list the families and then the total of the tribe and move on to the next tribe, concerns the tribe of Menashe. One of the households of this tribe is that of the Chefri, and we find the following insert. And Tzulafchad, son of Chefer, had no sons but daughters, and the names of the daughters of Tzulafchad were Machla and Noah, Chogla, Milka, and Tirza. And then the census of the tribe of Menashe concludes, these are the families of Menashe by their number, same formula, 52,700. Again, what does this parenthetical information concerning the daughters of Tzulafchad have to do with the census? It is clear that these daughters are not included in the census of all of the congregation of Bnei Israel, all those who went out as the army of Israel. The question is immediately resolved at the end of the census data, which occupies chapter 26, when the Torah recounts the story of the daughters of Tzulafchad. There it becomes clear that there is a connection between our two questions. The daughters of Tzulafchad, son of Chefer, drew close, who were of the family of Menashe, son of Yosef, and these are the names of the daughters. They stood before Moshe and Elazar, saying, our father died in the desert. But he was not among the congregation that rebelled against God, the congregation of Korach. Rather, he died for his own sin, and he had no sons. Why should the name of our father, this is still the daughters of Tzulafchad speaking, be disadvantaged in relation to his family because he had no son? Give us a possession among our father's brothers. Moshe brings their claim before God and receives the answer. The daughters of Tzulafchad speak rightly. They shall surely be given a possession for inheritance among the brothers of their father. The timing for the plea by the daughters of Tzulafchad is at the end of the census that is meant to pave the way for a division of the land among all the men counted. When the daughters of Tzulafchad heard that the land was being divided among the tribes to males and not to females, this is the Midrash, they gathered together. Right? This is the context of how did they approach Moshe. It was right on the heels of hearing about the division of the land. They were saying, why would we lose it? Why should we lose a share? The connection between the census and the claim by these women is hinted at in the mention made of their names in the list of the families of Menashe. The Torah hints to us that although they were women and were therefore not included in the census, they would nevertheless be permitted by God's command to be included in the purpose of the census, i.e., in the inheritance of the land by merit of their father, who took part in the Exodus, and it was those who left Egypt who would inherit the land. Thus, the total number of the tribe of Menashe, as stated in verse 34, after the names of the daughters of Tzulafchad in verse 33, includes them. In justifying their demands, so this is the answer to the question, why is this little addendum inserted here? Because this census at the end of the book, in chapter 26, has to do with the inheriting of the land. And they, while they're not counted in the census, are part of the inheriting of the land, and so they're included here. In justifying their demand, now we're going to link this back to our question about Reuven. In justifying their demand to receive the possession that their father should have been given in the land, Tzulafchad's daughters emphasize his right. Our father died in the desert, but he was not among the congregation that rebelled against God, the congregation of Korach. It would seem from their words that the congregation of Korach, Datan, Aviram, and all their families, lost their right to an inheritance in the land, right? Because what were the daughters of Tzulafchad saying? They were asking for a right to inherit. They were saying, yes, our father died, but he wasn't part of Korach's assembly, meaning he didn't forfeit his claim to inherit like they did. Indeed, Chazal deduce from their words here that those that complained and the congregation of Korach had no portion in the land. Now we understand why the sin and punishment of Datan and Aviram are mentioned after the census of the tribe of Reuven, as the Ramban explains. The text mentions this to tell us that Datan and Aviram and all they had were swallowed up, as our sages taught, to hint to us that they lost their portion in the land, even though they were among those who left Egypt and were worthy of inheriting. The mention of Datan and Aviram and of the daughters of Tzulafchad in the midst of the census data, again here, the census at the end of the book, therefore have two opposite purposes. Neither, admittedly, is actually included in the census. Datan and Aviram and their families were no longer alive when it was conducted, while Tzulafchad's daughters were not counted because they were women. But the Torah mentions Datan and Aviram in order to remove them from those included in the purpose of the census, the inheritance of the land, while the women are mentioned in order to include them in this inheritance. Were it not for the sin of Datan and Aviram, they would be included in the census and would merit to receive their proper portion of the land. For this reason, they are mentioned after the total number of the tribe of Ruvain, in order to illustrate thereby their absence from this total. The daughters of Tzalafchad, in contrast, are mentioned prior to the summary of the number of the tribe of Menashe, and this is meant to include them in the census of their tribe as people who are going to inherit the land. So just on its own, this is a nice sharp insight, which is we have our two in chapter 26, we have our two little narrative tangents from the census. One comes right at the after the kind of sum total of its tribe, and one comes before the sum total of its tribe. The daughters of Tzlafchad come before to include them in the number, not the literal number, but the purpose number. And the Datan and Aviram from the family of Ruvain are mentioned after, so they're sort of taken out. They don't count in the number, not in the literal number, but in the purpose. Well, they also don't count in the literal number, but in the purpose number. We may now venture a guess at the reason for the non-rounded number to hundreds of the tribe of Ruvain, again in the census at the end of the book, 43,730. This number hints to the lack, the missing members of this tribe, those who should have inherited but lost this right. Several people should have been included in this census, but were absent because they were swallowed up by the earth. Had the number been rounded to 43,700, as in the case of the other tribes, we would not have the sense that the tribe of Reuven was missing some of its numbers. Since the figure ends in 30, we may assume that the number of men aged 20 and upwards who were swallowed by the earth was several dozen. The appendix to the census of the tribe of Reuven, the story of the sin of Datan and Aviram and their sin, is simply the explanation for the special number and the lack in that tribe. This figure is deliberately not rounded in order to hint at a special problem that affected only this tribe. When Moshe blesses the tribes of Israel before his death, he begins his blessing of Reuven as follows: Yechi Reuven va'al yamot, may Reuven live and not die, vihi metav mispar, and may his people be numerous. Targum Onkelos translates this with an added dimension: may Reuven live in the world of eternal life and not die a second death, and may his people receive their inheritance by their number. So let's just go back for a moment to look at the original chart and sort of conclude with the overall principles and analysis that Rabbi Elchanan Samet gave us. So again, primarily focusing on the tribes, that's sort of the key part here, but we'll pause for a moment to look at the others. So the tribes are, in the solid tens of thousands, and therefore their rounding principle is the nearest 100. The exceptions are the tribe of Gad, which is an even 50, either because that's, was the exact number and is not roundable, or it was so close to 50 that it rounded to 50 because that's the significant unroundable midpoint. So it's considered a round number in its own right. All the others in the 10,000s are rounded to the nearest 100. At the end of the book, we have another census of the tribes, same order of magnitude of numbers, everything rounds to the hundreds. The exception is the tribe of Reuven, which is actually there to remind us of the missing from Datan and Aviram that we would sort of otherwise not know about if we had a whole rounded to 100 number. Then when we come to the Leviim aged a month and upwards, again, they're not quite 10,000, but upwards of 5,000. So they're already in this category, which is rounded to the nearest 100. The census of the Leviim age 30 to 50 is small enough, all under 4,000, that it's small enough that the rounding is to the nearest 10, and that's what we have. And Merari is rounded to the nearest 100, but his argument is that is actually a rounding to the nearest 10 because it was within 5 on either side of 3,200, so it was rounded that way. And then the firstborn requiring redemption was to the nearest 1, was meaning the precise number was given because this has to do with the issue of precise redemption, and we need to know the exact amount so that we get everybody and do the proper redemption with this sort of halachic consequence. Okay, so happy to hear any thoughts, reactions again. Not all of the essays of Rav Samet will be this as in the weeds, but when you look at Parashat Bamidbar, what's it about? It's a census, and there's lots of things you could talk about. But you look at the numbers and you ask, how do we understand these numbers? And I think he does a compelling and interesting job of surveying the existing opinions, challenging them, and offering a take where he has an organizing principle that covers most of the data, and for the last piece incorporates a story that really helps us understand that sort of exceptional case. Okay, coming to Lance, please.
What does the Hebrew word elef mean?
Oh, that's a great question. Some people say 1,000, but others would argue it actually just means a large number, I should say more precisely, a unit of some kind, a significant unit of some kind.
So if it doesn't mean 1,000, then it completely undermines and subverts every word you've just said, right?
Yes, it's challenging to interpret this if LF doesn't mean that. And I think it is actually possible that in some contexts it could mean unit, and in some contexts it could mean actual thousands, meaning it would be hard to use a number that didn't mean to refer to something truly numerical in the context of a census. When we're talking about sheep or military groupings, using LF to mean a battalion or something like that, I think makes perfect sense. But inside a census, again, that also has tens and things like that, I think it's harder to argue for LF just meaning, a grouping. But I bet you're going to have a response.
Well, I mean, I could, quote rabbis of Farber and other people who totally disagree with this. And I just want to quote Mark Twain, a definition of statistics. Are you familiar with that?
Nope. Thank you. Tell me.
Lies, more lies, damn lies, statistics.
Great. Great. And if there is an essay on this topic from the Torah.com and you have it, please pop the link into the chat. That's always a great kind of companion text to the things that we look at. So thank you, Moshe. And then we'll come to
the Levium, did that include the Kahanim, or that was something different?
Say it a little louder, Moshe. Sorry.
Levium,
yes.
Did that include the Kahanim or just the Levium?
That included the Kohanim.
Oh, okay. That's number one. Number two, wasn't Daram and Avihu part of the original people that came out of Egypt? So shouldn't they have died anyway in the desert?
Yes, but all those who came out of Egypt died in the desert. So may sharpen your question. Maybe I didn't understand it.
So the census that was given at the first time, those were the people that came out of Egypt. And the second one, that was the new generation. So what did it really matter? If they died in the desert or they died on the Korach.
Okay, yes, I think I understand your question. So yes, indeed, and Rav Samet mentioned this, they were already not included in the number of people in that second census because those, the people who came out of Egypt had already died. But that census was also organized by family because the families were the families of those who came out of Egypt were the ones according to whom the land was going to be divided. So even though, yes, they didn't count in the census, the actual numbers, like many of the people who had left Egypt who had already died, the adults who had left Egypt who already died, but because the census arranged itself by family for the apportionment of the land, they ought to have been included in that, but they weren't because of their sin.
So their family wasn't included, you're saying?
That's what the sages say, that they actually did not receive a portion in the land, and therefore there was a diminishment of the apportionment to Reuben because of that.
And one other question: you said that like when we have like 40 lashes, we take one away to only 39. So what about the 40 days when Moses told Bnei Israel to wait for him, and they miscalculated?
Yeah. Yeah, great. We should write a midrash about that. That's a
Me?
really interesting.
That's a good
Yes.
one. That's a
Yes,
good point.
although right, then maybe they understood 40 as that he was rounding up and they were
Right.
ready for him on day 39. Yeah, it's great. Joan, yes.
Yeah, this is on an important topic, a little different. We're trying to round up to $16,000. Thank you that you don't mind that I mentioned this. We
Please.
already have 11,000 for a mobile surveillance unit on the northern border. It's called the Project Montanyan, and it's listed on how to help Israel. So all of you who are on and you're worried about numbers and all that, give me several $1,000s more and get us up to 16,000 so we
Great.
can get that unit. They need it right now. They're getting
Thank you.
attacked. Thank you.
Great pitch. Round your donation up to the nearest 5,000.
Absolutely.
Great.
Yeah, many people
Great.
get thousands. So
Great.
yes.
Great. Great.
Mhm.
Thank you. Bracha, please.
I'm not good with numbers, so this is a little confusing, but my sense of things is more of a conceptual one, and I don't know whether or not there's a tie-in. I had put it in the chat. Let me just see if I can find. Yeah, is there a connection between people missing to the initial rejection of the land by the 2.5 tribes?
Because that is right. So those tribes are Ruvain, Gad, and Chatzi Shevet Menashe, and you're noting that the tribes that have these sort of not rounded to the nearest 100 are indeed Ruvain in the end of the book, God in the beginning, and then while Menashe is a round number, they did also have that sort of special discussion, about the daughters of Tzalafchad. So that's very interesting. It certainly seems plausible. I could imagine a whole other approach, making that connection. It doesn't map 100% because the Ruvain one is at the beginning of the book when we're sort of not in the context of the land per se. But still, from like a global view, when you just look at all the data and you see these are the two tribes, and in a certain sense with Menashe partially, that was the half tribe, that sort of have this distinct feature, and they have that in common. So I think there's certainly a correlation, and whether we can argue a kind of a causal link is a good question. But I'm glad you raised that. That's a really nicely noticed. Yeah. Back to Moshe. Last word here.
Okay. I believe Ben Gurion says if we could raise an army of over 500,000 men, Israel would be more or less invincible. I think that's how much they have now. I think the army is 20 divisions, so I think they have. I think a division is. I'm not sure if it's 10,000. I guess they have like 3 armies in Israel if you look at it that way.
Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, great. Thank you, Lance, for popping in a couple of articles for us to look at. I encourage everybody to check them out. And
I just want to point out that the Torah's Exodus article is by Rabbi Zev Farber, who is a graduate of YCT, right, and the senior editor of Torah.com. Both these articles are from Torah.com. And in my estimation, Rabbi Farber is a world-class scholar.
He's fantastic. I enjoyed every day that I shared in the YCT Beit Midrash with him. So yes, thank you for sharing them. And again, I think this is something a little different from what we typically dive into in our Parshat Shavua. And I hope we'll have fruitful encounters with Rabbi Elchanan Salmon over the coming weeks. Again, I'll try to share a little bit more background next week. And thanks for sticking this one out together. So
It was a little
Well,
ended very well. Let's put
yes, yes.
I believe there was like a Jeopardy question. This game is played. This illegal game is played in the ghetto. And the answer is numbers.
Yes, and my parents can remind me afterwards what old Saturday Night Live skit it was where whoever it was said it was my understanding that there would be no math. So thanks for going along with it. And
All right.
wish
Okay,
everybody a great
good
rest
for
of the week.
brain, good for the
Next
brain.
week we're already going to be at 9 p.m. So thanks
Okay.
for intrepid, late night learning, getting us ready for Shavuot.
All right,
Very
whatever.
good.
Take
Love
care.
you.
Take
Yeah,
care.
good night,
Bye.
Have
all.
a nice week, everybody. Bye.
You too.
Beautiful.
Night all.